So talk a little bit about the history, maybe your experience with Barry and some of your thoughts on teaching Detroit Hustle, how it's different. I'll just let you go.
So when I learned about the Detroit Hustle from the dancers who were actually doing a lot of dancing in the 60s, was a group of, the most consistent story, it's a group of Cubans came from Miami to Detroit, and they showed up at an old disco on the east side of Detroit called, back then, the Butterfly Suite, and later it was known as the Characters. And the group came in and they started doing what they called hustle. They refer to themselves as the Gypsies. So some of the Detroit dancers from back in the day will say the Gypsies came in from Miami and they started doing this crazy new dance to the synthesized music that was being played in the mid-60s. And so from there, some of the local dance teachers caught hold of it and thought it was cool and started trying to imitate it.
So who were the first teachers in the area that were doing it?
So in the 60s, we would Barry Douglas was there, Mark Brock was around, Michael Leach, Dorian Deaver, and a few others, but those are kind of the major players I know danced a lot of hustle in the 60s and 70s. The Detroit hustle kind of emerged over time, so in the earlier days, people were doing whatever dance genre was going on in their area was kind of the major influence. So if they were doing a lot of Latin dancing, you had a little bit of a Latin influence to the hustle. The New York dancers, when they caught hold of it, they're pretty famous in New York for doing a lot of adagio, so they threw in a lot of overhead aerials in their hustle, so you get that art form incorporated in this Latin hustle. And in Detroit, we had a lot of ballroom studios, Arthur Murray studios, and people were trying to make up some sort of other hustle. Some of the hustles that came out during the 60s were the foxytrot hustle.
Oh yeah.
The merengue hustle.
They called everything a hustle. Tango
Yep.
hustle.
Yeah, and the tango hustle, people believe, got its name because in the movie Saturday Night Fever, John Travolta does his final dance, and then he takes the girl into partner, and he does a promenade.
Promenade, yeah.
And so then,
Choreographers.
yeah,
connection.
yep. So he creates this big interest in tango hustle. Local teachers said that the phone started ringing after that movie came out, and everyone wanted to learn that dance John Travolta
And this
did.
was quite a bit after the original hustle was danced. It was danced in the 60s, that came out in the 70s.
Yep. So this comes in the 70s when the movie comes out. So the Detroit teachers had already seen it through this group of gypsies that came from Miami, and they were trying to figure this dance out because it was so fun. Also at that time, bars in the area, they would hold these big dance contests. So there was Reggie's, Uncle Sam's, the Spree, Characters. But the bars, to get people in, they would offer a really big prize, like $1,000 first place for the best hustle couple in the late 60s, early 70s. So the teachers really went for it because that was a lot of money back then for a one night at the bar dance contest.
Still pretty good.
It is good. And brag rights. So the teachers started going to the bars and showing their best hustle stuff. Michael Leach was the first one in Detroit to lift his partner, throw her overhead, catch her, and then keep spinning her to a hustle rhythm. He was also our first male teacher who was on Dance Fever in Detroit with the hustle, and I believe they won that. And then later on, Barry Douglas won Dance Fever doing the hustle.
I didn't know Barry was on there.
He was. He did a hustle.
Was he dancing with you then?
No, he was dancing with Anja. I don't know what her last name at the time, but Warfal is her last name now, her married name. So he and Anja were on Dance Fever. I was probably watching them, the next generation, when I was a kid. And so Barry and Anja were also on Dance Fever, and I think
He's watching Dance Fever.
Yeah, so sitting on my living room floor at 7, watching the Dance Fever. So they had a lot of hustle. So Michael Leach was our first teacher on it, and he did do overhead lifts. He was the first teacher in Metro Detroit to do it, and then of course they all started grabbing it. What happened was all the teachers and the top level dancers now were throwing their partners in the air, and it became not friendly for the majority of the public.
They were doing that in the clubs?
They did for a while. There were people lifting in the clubs, kind of like Lindy Hop. You know, Lindy Hop dancers sometimes will throw dancers in the air. There is an etiquette to it, but that usually comes later when people start getting dropped on. But what happens is it becomes too fast and too aerobic for the regular social dancer.
Well, it's certainly not a social dance.
Yeah, so that is no longer a social dance. So people lost interest in it. And so some would say...
Where was that in the time frame?
You know, I would say kind of in the later 70s when the disco era was dying out. We like to call anything where you touch your partner, touch dance.
Right.
So the music is changing. We're leaving that touch dance era of ballroom, Latin, swing, hustle, and we're getting into that freestyle era in the 80s. People start breaking apart from their dance partners. I know in Detroit, the public schools stopped teaching social dance in the late 70s, so I don't know if that has...
So they were teaching it up until that time?
Yeah, not hustle. They would teach like square dancing.
But that wasn't happening in all the schools, so that may be a regional thing.
Yeah, in Michigan they had it, so I don't know if it was across the country. But in Michigan, social dancing was taught in the public school system. So in the late 70s, we saw budget cuts in the schools, and they started taking out social dance or touch dancing. And then we kind of get into the early 80s, and we see this big movement of freestyle dancing. And so some would say hustle died off there, but there were folks in Metro Detroit who continued to develop the dance. So Barry Douglas, who has a background, he's a master of jazz dance, and he has an engineering background. He really liked the dance, and he started to develop his system of hustle, which we call the Detroit Hustle. And along with him, dancing it at Characters, which was the last kind of surviving disco in Michigan in the 80s. He continued to dance along with some of the other teachers. They were no longer throwing their partners overhead unless it was for performance or showcase.
When I started competing, which would have been in the 80s, we still had it at the United States Championships. And at that time, it was all tricks.
Yep.
And my former partner, Chuck Bannister, had been the hustle champion, as he said, when it was still dancing. So that had to be, I'm guessing, in the late 70s. I didn't see him with Brenda. But it was all in the air, and they would do one or two steps on the floor, and then it was
Back up in the air.
up in the air.
And then down in a turn and then back up in the air. And what was amazing was they really didn't lose a beat. So they could do these overhead lifts and tricks and bring the girl down and still be on a hustle beat. In Detroit, we did have the Arthur Murray influence, and they also taught hustle, but it's different than the hustle that we know as Detroit hustle. So we get in the ballroom world and New York hustle, Latin hustle, we start with a rock back instead of a pull forward. And the idea around the Detroit hustle...
Did Barry develop that?
That's my understanding. That's my research points to him. He developed this method. His belief was that when the two come forward on the first beat, they can compress and spring off of each other and start to create kind of an energy move. And so he developed where the dancers came forward and sprung back through the compression. So from a very early point in learning, we teach our students to work off of each other's energy.
And he also slots the hustle.
Correct. So one of the main differences you'll see in Detroit hustle versus the rope hustle, Latin hustle, New York style is we are slotted, a lot like West Coast swing. So our dancers move from point A to B. We don't jump to C and D and E and F and different angles in the room. So we try to keep the girl on the straight line. So if you can imagine a train track, the lead owns the tracks and the girl owns a slot in the middle of the track. So his job is to jump the tracks to accommodate her staying on the slot.
Was he doing a lot of West Coast at the time? Is that how he developed that?
No, we did not really get a good introduction to West Coast until the 90s. when Bob and Beverly Basinski brought it to us. They were on the circuit. They were really interested in us seeing the West Coast that was being done because he thought it was so similar to Hustle. So West Coast was also slotted, getting the girl from point A to B pretty easily. And, you know, seeing what we did in Detroit Hustle, Bob thought it was a great marriage. He thought Detroit dancers needed to learn West Coast because it was so similar to what we do. And in some ways, in the earlier days before we really learned the construction of West Coast, it almost looked the same with a little triple at the end. So then we had people were creating something called Swussle, where they
like Swango.
Yeah, like Swango. Yeah. So, and that's what keeps these dances alive. New generations keep creating new versions of it. And so there are two takes on Swango. So in the 90s in Detroit Hustle dancers would do Hustle, and then they would break out very easily into a West Coast pattern.
Oh, well, that's Swussle.
And that's
Not
what
Swango.
we used to call Swussle. Yeah, so swing and hustle.
I never heard that.
Yep, so that was Swussle. And then Swussle became something different. So then Swussle became kind of a mix of the patterns were all half hustle. Instead of two separate patterns, one swing, one hustle, and leading the transition from one dance to the next, they merged the patterns. So then you get this kind of melting pot of movements. Some are calling it fusion dancing now, where they're kind of mixing up all the patterns from all the dances. But the original Swussle, as I recall it in Detroit, was you transition from a hustle pattern to a West Coast pattern. They were two separate dances being danced to the same song with a smooth transition and then back to the other dance. Where the newer Swussle or fusion becomes kind of a half hustle step and half swing, West Coast swing step merged together. And so if you don't have a very clean lead and you're not a very careful follower, you're going to miss it. It's just like all over the place. So it's hard for dancers to transition that, I think, as smoothly as they would like, because it really takes a very precise, confident lead to be able to communicate. You just change the language and back again. And then, or if you think of having a conversation where you're speaking half the conversation in English and half in Spanish, well, now they're doing the same sentence with Spanish and English mixed up. That's kind of the newer Swussle. So, but in the 90s, the West Coast came, and it was a beautiful blend. But along with going kind of back to the 80s and the development of hustle, I met Barry in '88.
Were you already in the dance business then?
I was. So I was at an Arthur Murray for the first year in '87 to '88.
Were you teaching? Did you go as a student?
I was teaching, and I did all of my early ballroom training there. And they had hustle on the syllabus. And for some reason, the hustle was not connecting for me. It was my least favorite dance to teach. It was more with the rocking back action. I don't know if it was how it was explained to me or I just resisted it. But it wasn't clear to me how this dance functioned the way it was on the syllabus. One of my students really wanted to learn it. And so we played around with it, and I was a young teacher, so I always assumed, okay, I just don't have the teaching skill to get this dance across to this guy. So I reached out for some help, so some of the more experienced teachers helped get my student going. But then suddenly he showed up with a whole different feel. And so I said, are you taking hustle somewhere else? He smiled, he said, why? I said, well, your hustle feels totally different. What's going on? And he whispers in my ear, I'm taking from that Barry Douglas
That
guy.
Barry?
That man. And I said, well, it's working. And so I left Arthur Murray that summer, and my student Paul, he called me up. He said, my dance partner can't make our hustle lesson with Barry. Will you partner up with me and learn this dance, or this for an hour? I said, okay.
Did Barry have his own school then?
So he did. So he had a studio. It was about a year old in Metro Detroit in Kegel Harbor, Michigan. So he was a ballet, tap, and jazz studio, and then Barry came with his own hustle following, and he was trying to start a ballroom department. So he had reached out to some local ballroom teachers who also did hustle in Detroit, some long-term established teachers, and his hope was to add, besides just hustle as the one touch dance, the ballroom dances to his studio programming. So when I came in, I danced with my student for an hour, and Barry just took my hands in a double handhold, and he was talking to my student, and next thing you know, I was moving back and forth, and I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm moving. I didn't even know it was coming. He didn't explain anything. He just weighted my foot in the right direction. And he started a pattern, we call it a quarter turn open, and it's where the man rotates 90 degrees to the right, and it's a great exercise to get the man rotating 90 degrees to the right, allowing the girl to own the slot, and also do what we call a split lead. So when he moves to the right side of his body turns, and when he moves to the left side of his body takes the girl. There's no pulling or pushing. So all he's doing is moving his body right and left. And because I was connected here and it stayed on the right, I felt the move to the right, then I felt it to the left.
Really good basic dance technique.
It was great basic dance technique, and Barry said he always used that as a tool to teach the quarter turn footwork and the split lead for the guy, because without that, you're getting all these different messages in the conversation, and the girl's trying to figure out what he's doing. Too much motion in the lead. It's really a lead through the body, just like in ballroom. It's not a push and pull through the arms, and it gives the illusion that there's more going on with the arms. But really, it's coming from the body
just
and the
like in Latin
compression.
dancing.
Just like in Latin
It's an
dancing.
illusion,
Yep.
but it's not. It's all coming from weight.
Yeah. And how you connect. So, and that's the hardest thing for our dancers to learn. It takes the most time, but if they learn about it from the beginning and they are constantly reminded, eventually it starts to come together for them. And so, so I had this fun lesson. I was super excited. I'm like, oh, I see why you like this Detroit hustle. And about a month or so later, Barry reached out to my student and invited me into the conversation about adding ballroom to his studio. And so I came in as a ballroom teacher and worked with his new students. And then I had a background in ballet, tap, and jazz, so I worked with some of his beginner jazz dancers. So I was really excited because, you know, he's a different generation. He comes with all these experiences I missed. And the coaches and teachers he was bringing in, some of them I coached with when I was at Arthur Murray's, and people I had admired. So I was really excited when I got the invite to come to the conversation. But when I walked in, I was scared to death because I see the guy who certified me at Murray's. I see 3 of the top level teachers in the area at the meeting, Barry, and then there's my 19-year-old self going, I'm here. And so they were very nice. And what one of my coaches said, which made me feel really good, was I was new and young and I was coming with no bad habits. So I was trainable. So
There you go.
So since maybe because I avoided hustle early on, you know, I was like open to learning it from the Detroit hustle perspective. It was just a really practical, logical dance. For me, my work in hustle, what I realized down the line was there are really only 2 things the lady does with her feet to accomplish 100 plus steps. She's doing a basic in place and a 180-degree turn. Everything else is turn related, a chaîné turn or like a pirouette-based turn. So for the man, he's got, in the beginning, about 4 basic movements with his body. You know, he has a facing basic, he has a quarter turn right, a quarter turn left, and a half turn. So from those 4 placements of his feet, he can accomplish over 100 plus patterns. What changes the dance is the body position. If the guy brings the girl into a parallel, she's still doing the same footwork, except swinging her into a parallel or a sweetheart position. A lot of people know as sweetheart, swings her hip open a little more. So her basic just gets bigger and expands more, but it's the same pattern over and over. Once the girl establishes her forward basic and her 180-degree basic, she can follow way more patterns than she's learned until he starts to turn her. Then she has to really know how to turn properly. So that's where coming in to the studio, learning how to chaîné turn on your own is going to be helpful, because a lot of our free spins are chaîné turn based, and then we get tuck turns, which are on one foot. Typically, like in this Latin and the swing world, you're getting that compression, you're getting those quick turns. They're all interconnected, which is crazy. The techniques that we use in Detroit Hustle can be used in any of the Latin dances, and the Latin dance technique.
It goes back and forth.
They are. They're
still two bodies.
Yep.
Working around each other.
And I think that, to me, Detroit Hustle is so strong because we were such a heavy ballroom state. There were quite a few Arthur Murrays back in the earlier days in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and a lot of those teachers really grabbed hold of hustle. So my guess, I wasn't there back then, would be that their hustle felt different at Arthur Murray than maybe in a different part of the country, because we were working off of these compressions. Or I guess maybe the hustle felt better because we were borrowing from the ballroom world, is my point, and incorporating them into Detroit Hustle. So it was really that ballroom influence that helped us, I think, and Barry and Michael and all those guys develop that good compression, connection, and then we get that West Coast, that one more element thrown in there in the 90s. It just kind of smoothed it all out.
Is there any hustle scene in the clubs anymore, or is it just now in the studios in this area?
So there our disco closed in the 90s, our last surviving disco characters, and it was a sad day. We still have, through social media, we'll do a call out to all friends, we call it Friends of the Butterfly Suite and Characters, and they'll have meetups, and they'll go to different studios or different events, and they'll meet up and dance. Here at our studio, recently I had a gentleman come in. He told me 25 years ago he used to go to Characters when Barry and I were there, and he'd watch us dance, and he came in with a group of dancers from Toledo every Saturday night from Toledo to dance at Characters, which was at 14 Mile and Van Dyke on Detroit's east side. So that's quite a commitment. Now, I'm not sure if they were housed at someone's home, but I do know we had dancers come from Ann Arbor to Characters every Saturday. So that was really the hub. When Characters closed, I mean, of course, the place was packed. But it was time for them to move on, and the owners, and to do something different. And they sold the building. So now we don't really have a home disco, but there is a hustle scene, and all the studios in Detroit pretty much teach hustle. There are hustle clubs. We have the Michigan Society for Swing and Hustle Dancers. Anywhere we see West Coast, you're seeing hustle in Metro Detroit. So we do call it Detroit Hustle. It is a different face. I think it merges nicely with the New York Hustle or Latin Hustle or what the ballroom world does, if it can be led. So we're relying on the leader to know how to transition the two conversations, to blend them together properly.
How long was your career with Barry?
It was 10 years. So we started off in American Rhythm, and we were just doing hustle for fun. His previous dance partner, Anja, also worked at the studio. So if there was any needed performance, they would do hustle. They were established back in the 70s. People knew them. She was working at the studio less and less, and I was doing more and more hustle. And we did a dance tour in Russia in '89. And so when we went to Russia, I was able to do some performance with Barry in the Detroit Hustle, which was a lot of fun. So I really got submerged in it during that practice season. He just needed a little bit more hustle, and I was it. And it was a lot of fun. And we did do some overhead lifts in our hustle for performances. We never did any tricks, sweeps, overheads on a social dance floor. It was just way too dangerous. You never know who you're going to come down on. Once we did do a performance at Characters, and what was so funny about that was, they had a disco ball, and they had lights coming up off the floors, and they had a mirrored ceiling. So they had this disco ball with all the lights flaring on the floor and all the reflection off the mirror, and Barry does a move, and he spins me up, and I'm face up spinning, and I'm looking at this disco ball and these lights and the mirror and watching myself spin faster and faster. And then he brings me down to the shoulder and down to a free spin, and God help me, I thought I was going to puke. It's like that.
But you didn't.
And fortunately, like in Hustle, in Detroit Hustle, we do, I call them rest steps. And so when you watch, if you saw an old video of Barry and I dance, you'll see moves that don't travel, don't move, don't lift. It might be a dip, it might be a sweep, it might be hitches. But those are rest steps. It's really hard to keep up to a song that's 136 beats a minute without some sort of breaking point, you're coming out of a turn or from a crazy overhead lift, watching yourself in the mirror, and you really need to get your bearings back. And so he was a master at that. He just kind of knew what his dance partner needed at every moment of the song.
Even for a show, though, that gives it light and shade. It's not all the same flavor.
Right, and it does. It's just more interesting. But I believe, Barry just had a gift for engineering this dance. I think a lot of folks did it, and I think they did it really well. But the credit seems to head toward him, and Mark Brock danced a lot, Michael Leach. So they all know Detroit Hustle, but they also do other styles of hustle, and those guys can lead those transitions nicely. But it's really important to be able to be really in tune with your dance partner and feel what they need. He broke my nose once in an event.
Oh, no.
We were in a performance in Kentucky. I didn't know it was broken. I barely knew I got hit, and lights were dim, and we were doing a fun performance at a club for a club that hired us, and he was so sensitive to how I moved or any of his partners moved. Apparently I was wobbling in a way that wasn't. He said to me, "Are you all right?" I'm like, "Yeah, keep going." And I'm dancing, and he just stops. And he puts his arm around me, walks me off the floor, and he goes, "Yeah, you're not okay." And I still was, I just didn't, the impact was so fast and hard, I just barely felt it at the time, and then I realized, yep, my nose is broken. And so, but it was really, I saw a guy once in a club, this was a Lindy Hopper in a club in Detroit, and you can feel what's going on underneath your feet. It was a bar, someone had broken a beer glass, it was wet, and these Lindy Hoppers or rockabilly dancers come out of nowhere, and he's flying around the room with her. And all of the hustle dancers we were with kind of backed up. They're like, "Oh no, it's coming." And this guy threw this girl in the air. He didn't quite catch her. She slipped because she couldn't get her footing on the floor with broken glass. And this guy was so unaware of his partner's whereabouts.
The dilemma.
He yanked her back up so he could still keep moving and kept dancing. And the look of horror on her face, the poor thing. Fortunately, she wasn't cut but you could tell that the floor was sweat. It was getting sticky, and so it's fast and slow, and you can hear the glass being pushed around. So you have to really be aware of your partner, and I think Barry has always done that. All of our guys, our teachers in Detroit, were really good of knowing and how to take care of their partners, because again, you're dancing 136 beats a minute, and a lot can happen. It is a sport, but it did scare a lot of folks off in the 70s when the music got that fast. It really did. So now, 2018, you have, people love to dance to Tracy Chapman. Give me one reason. Very slow, moving hustle. You can do a lot of different dances to it, but I use that one sometimes for teaching because it gives our beginners.
For beginners, sure.
Yeah, it gives our beginners a chance to really learn the movement, the compression. If they're constantly thinking of just staying up to that super fast music, they miss so much. So I do like that a lot of our dancers today are willing to slow it down.
It's like learning to play an instrument.
Yeah.
You wouldn't play at the normal tempo, you can't think that fast.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons it's still around is teachers who are experienced teachers have recognized that. So in the classroom, we've tried to slow it down to a learning pace. Sometimes our students will nudge us and say, "It's really fast." And we will, I'll tell my students that, it's not a slow dance, and you get to a point in hustle where you need to start executing when you're an advanced dancer, power moves. And to be able to keep up with that music, that super fast music, you have to learn and rely on your partner more, how to work off your partner, how to generate energy without pushing and pulling.
Same as Latin.
Yeah, and so the girl is not executing a super fast turn on her own. She's using that beautiful connection that the guy is giving her when she's dancing, and then the guy can do the same. So, and then also again back to the guy, the lead, if it's a female or male, has to really be in constant touch with where his partner is, because he's really in control of her safety in a lot of ways. You know, these swing dances and hustles and Latin, I mean, they're fast moves, turning. I'm sure injury is not, you know, solo to, you know, independent to hustle dancing. You know,
No, not at all.
how many ballroom dancers, you know, have been injured?
All of us.
Yeah. So it's nice to just have those partnerships where you can really trust your partner. And I think that now in the 70s, that maybe that wasn't there. People were a little wild and crazy when they were first developing the dance. But I think as it's survived 5 decades now, people are more sensitive in how to teach it, how to develop it, how to perform it, how to dance it.
I was talking with a couple of tango dancers, Argentine tango dancers, and they said there's so much focus now on proper mechanics and elegance and scientific approach, but now trying to go back and get the root of it and go back to the old school where they really use their weight. Maybe they didn't use their weight in a refined way, but they still had that organic. So it's interesting because I see the same thing going on in our form of dance, in ballroom and maybe in hustle too, trying to learn more to refine it, but maintain that earthy quality to it.
Yeah.
So can we take a look at
Sure.
some of the things you might have as pointers for
Okay.
maybe babies that are starting?
Sure. I'd love to.